The vast emptiness of space stretched endlessly, broken only by the scattered lights of distant stars and the hum of the alien ship's engines. Inside the sleek, metallic vessel, Commander Varric paced with an air of calm, his elongated limbs making no sound as he moved across the command deck. His silvery blue skin shimmered under the harsh lights, and his obsidian eyes gleamed through countless battles and missions. Today, however, he felt something else, a subtle, unfamiliar unease. He called. Varric had led his people through countless campaigns, from the icy moons of Lasca III to the molten surface of Vicor. But this mission felt different. They were not here to conquer, to destroy. They were here to abduct. "Do you feel that, Zal?" Varric's voice cut through the silence, addressing his second-in-command, Zal, who stood by the holographic map that illuminated the bridge. Her angular face was expressionless as she adjusted the ship's course, but Varric had learned to read the smallest signs of discomfort. Zal didn't look up from her display, but her words were careful. "What do you mean, Commander?" "What?" "The air," he said softly, his gaze scanning the stars outside the viewports. "It feels dense, almost too full of life." Zal's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. As the ship's chief strategist, she knew the commander's instincts were rarely wrong, even if he didn't always follow them. She also knew that Varric was never one to let feelings influence his decisions. The map flickered on the screen, and a blue orb appeared at the center. Earth, a small, seemingly insignificant planet in the distant part of the galaxy. Varric's mission was straightforward: extract one human from the planet's surface and return to the ship. There was no need for diplomacy, no need for understanding the nuances of their society. They simply needed a specimen for research, one that could help them gain an edge in the ongoing war against the Bexari. "Prepare for the extraction," Varric commanded, his voice firm. "We'll take the human hostage as planned. The samples we need for our research will give us an advantage." Zal glanced at him, then nodded. "Yes, Commander." They had done their research on the human species, a primitive, emotional race with a surprising level of intelligence, but not enough to pose a threat to the power of Varric's people. The humans were no different from the other species they had abducted over the centuries. Expendable. Or so he thought. As the ship entered Earth's atmosphere, Varric felt the familiar tension of battle in his bones, but it was muted, replaced by the anticipation of a simple mission. His species had perfected the art of subjugating lesser races, and this task should have been no different. They arrived in the dead of night beneath the cover of a clouded sky. The small town below, surrounded by thick woods and empty fields, appeared quiet, peaceful. It was the perfect location for an abduction, isolated, remote. They would move swiftly, extract the target, and return to the ship without anyone ever knowing they had been there. Varric studied the map one last time before turning to his team. "We've located our target, a human female, a scientist of some kind. She'll be useful for our research. We'll take her with us, and then we will be on our way." Gal, always practical, nodded but seemed distracted by something in the atmosphere. "Are we sure about this one, Commander? This woman. She's not a soldier, she's a civilian. I can't help but wonder if—" "You question me, Zal?" Varric's tone was colder than usual. Zal straightened immediately, her posture rigid. "No, Commander." "Then follow the plan," Varric said, his voice brokering no argument. He turned on his heel, his cloak swirling behind him as he moved toward the ship's hangar, where the team was waiting. "Watch the city," Rain said. The ground team, made up of 4 elite soldiers, emerged from the ship's belly and into the forest, their adaptive armor blending them seamlessly with the shadows. They moved like ghosts, their boots silent against the forest floor. Each one was a specialist in stealth and reconnaissance, and they worked in perfect harmony as they approached the house where the human scientist lived. The house itself was unremarkable, small, made of wood and stone, nestled quietly on the edge of the woods. But it stood alone, surrounded only by the night and the distant rustling of trees. It was the perfect target. And yet, as they approached, Varrock couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. The air around them seemed alive, charged with an unfamiliar energy. "Commander," Saul whispered over the communication channel, her voice tense. "This feels strange. The readings from the atmosphere—" "I don't care about readings, I care about the mission," Varrock cut her off sharply, but his voice had a slightly harder edge than usual. "Proceed with caution." The soldiers moved swiftly, reaching the front door of the house without making a sound. Varrock's lead soldier, Jarek, approached the door, preparing to breach it, but before he could make a move, the door opened with a soft creak. Standing there, framed by the soft glow of the interior light, was the human. She was older than he had expected, her features sharp, but there was something in her eyes that made Varrock pause. It wasn't fear. It was something more calculating. And in that moment, Varrock knew this would not be as simple as he had hoped. The woman stood perfectly still, her gaze locking with Varrock's. Her eyes were deep brown, full of intelligence and defiance. She had known they were coming. Free Sagazine picked up the early transcript and read it slowly and silently, her gaze coming back to Varrock's after a nonchalant pause. "And who are you?" she asked in English, her voice calm, steady. She was not shouting, not pleading, as Varrock had expected. She was simply, "We are here for you," Varrock said, his tone cold. "We need your cooperation. If you resist, there will be consequences." "I shouldn't worry," Murphy said, trying to recover his composure. The woman's lips curled into a faint smile, and her voice dropped to a low murmur. "What kind of monster does this to another being?" He shook his head in disbelief, saying to himself. Varrock's soldiers hesitated for a fraction of a second, but Varrock quickly regained control. "You will come with us. This is not up for negotiation." In a flash, the soldiers lunged forward, and the woman was overpowered, though she fought back with surprising strength. Her body was not as weak as Varrock had assumed. She kicked and struggled, but the soldiers were prepared, and within moments they had restrained her and dragged her toward the hovering craft. "Quiet!" one of the soldiers hissed, his hand clamped over her mouth, though the woman's eyes never lost their defiance. Once aboard the ship, the human was placed in a sterile examination room. There were no windows, no familiar comforts, just cold metallic walls and harsh, blinding lights. The woman was strapped to a table, her wrists bound by unyielding restraints, but Varrock could tell she was not afraid. It was as if she knew something they did not. The ship's medic, a tall, thin creature with translucent skin, moved around her, preparing for the scans and tests they needed. Varrock stood back, his arms crossed, watching as the medic began to activate the equipment. "This is a simple procedure," Varrock said. "We only need a few samples. Your cooperation will make this easier for you. If you resist, we will be forced to use more aggressive methods." The woman's eyes flicked toward him, her expression unreadable. "I'll cooperate as much as I need to," she said, her voice level. "But you should know something. What you're doing will come with consequences. You think you can just take me and leave without any repercussions?" "You're wrong." Varrock raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the woman's boldness. He had expected fear, desperation, but instead she was calm, unnervingly so. His soldiers had never seen such resolve in their captives. "Exactly," Saraba said, choosing his words. He leaned in slightly, his voice low. "What do you mean by that?" he asked. "I mean," she said, her lips curving into a wry smile, "that humans are adaptable. You don't know what you've unleashed by taking me. You've made a mistake." Varric felt a flicker of something. As the scans progressed, the woman's body began to react. Her heart rate spiked and the scanners buzzed, emitting an alarming series of beeps. The readings were fluctuating wildly, showing sudden spikes of activity in her neural and metabolic systems. "What's happening?" Tal's voice crackled over the comms, her concern evident. "This wasn't in the data," the technician muttered. "Her biology, it's adapting faster than anything we've seen." Varric felt his stomach tighten. They had underestimated her, underestimated humans entirely. The woman was not merely enduring the tests, she was evolving in real time. Her body was adjusting, compensating for the invasive scans, her nervous system rapidly learning how to resist them. Keller took in what seemed the longest time to reach the top of the steps. Probably 60 seconds. But then the door turned. For the first time in his long career, Commander Varric felt a chill run down his spine. The woman was no longer just a hostage. She was something far more dangerous than he had imagined. Sarah Williamson had always considered herself a person who believed in the possible, no matter how unlikely. As a scientist, her life had been shaped by the pursuit of knowledge, the unrelenting drive to understand the unknown. But as she lay strapped to a cold metallic table in a sterile, lifeless room aboard an alien ship, she had to admit, this was beyond anything she could have ever imagined. The room was illuminated by harsh, unforgiving lights that made every inch of her skin feel exposed. Every movement was a reminder of her captivity, the weight of the restraints tight against her wrists and ankles cutting into her. Her throat was dry, and her mind buzzed with the shock of the events that had unfolded since the moment she had been snatched from her home. She had been so sure she was alone that night, so wrapped up in her research that she hadn't even heard the hum of the ship until it was too late. She hadn't even seen the faces of her captors. They moved too quickly, too silently. One moment she had been sitting in front of her fireplace, reading an article on climate change, and the next she was dragged into the air, her body weightless, as the ground below her disappeared into nothingness. Now she was alone in a room, surrounded by beings she could not understand. They weren't human, that much was clear. The commander, the one who had spoken first, had an otherworldly presence about him. His silvery blue skin, his elongated limbs, and the cold intelligence in his dark eyes were unlike anything she had ever seen. But it was the air around him that made her wary. The feeling of being studied. And the fact that they weren't speaking English anymore. At first it had been easy to understand their language. Their words were clipped, mechanical, but they made sense. The more they spoke, the less she understood. The language began to lose its clarity, turning into an unintelligible hum in the back of her mind. She could sense their intentions now, their cold, emotionless desire to extract something from her, but she didn't know what that something was. The door to her cell slid open with a soft hiss, and she immediately tensed. The figure that entered was tall and broad-shouldered, with silver skin that shimmered faintly in the light. He was dressed in the same uniform as the commander, dark, sleek, almost military in its design, but there was something different about him. His posture was stiff, as if he were carrying the weight of responsibility, and his eyes, though still inhuman, betrayed a flicker of curiosity. "Are you comfortable?" he asked, his voice strange but clearer than most of the others. The words were mechanical, but somehow they seemed to cut through the haze of confusion that had settled over her. There was something unsettlingly familiar in his tone, as if he had been trained to speak with a kind of detachment. Sarah narrowed her eyes, trying to gauge his intentions. "Comfortable?" she repeated. "You've kidnapped me from my home and strapped me to a table. I don't think comfortable is the right word." The creature tilted his head slightly, his eyes scanning her as if trying to decipher her emotions. "You misunderstand. I meant to ask if you are in pain." For a moment she didn't respond. It was an odd question, considering the circumstances. The restraints, the foreign technology, the invasive machinery, all of it seemed designed for one purpose: to break her. But she wasn't broken. Not yet. "Fine," she said finally, her voice rough with fatigue. Just tell me why you've brought me here. What do you want from me?" The creature hesitated before stepping closer, examining her with what seemed like a mixture of fascination and calculation. "You are of interest to us, human. You possess attributes that are valuable for research: your species' resilience, your adaptive abilities." "You're studying me?" she interrupted sharply, disbelief rising in her chest. "Like some kind of lab rat?" The creature didn't flinch, merely watching her with an unsettling calmness. "You are no different than any other subject we have studied. Your species has potential that could benefit us in our war." Sarah's heart stilled for a moment. "War?" "War?" she echoed, trying to make sense of it all. "What war? Who are you fighting?" "We are fighting a species called the Bexari," the creature explained. "A race much like ours, but different. They have advanced in ways that threaten our survival. We seek ways to improve our strength, our adaptability, and you, human, you represent a key to that." He paused. "Your biology is far more complex than we anticipated." The words landed like bricks in her mind. The Bexari. And her. A key. Before she could formulate a response, the door slid open again. This time, the figure that entered was different. Smaller, more fragile-looking. But there was something unnerving in the air around them. A shiver of unease ran down Sarah's spine as the figure approached, their eyes scanning the machines around her with sharp, focused precision. "This one is unusual," the new arrival remarked, their voice almost a whisper, sharp like glass. "Her neural activity is unlike anything we've seen. She's resisting the scans, adapting in ways we couldn't predict." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Resistance? Adapting? "What's happening?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Why can't you just leave me alone?" The alien, what she could only assume was a technician, moved to the side, standing beside a large holographic screen that displayed a series of chaotic, fluctuating readings. "She's evolving," the technician muttered, more to itself than to her. "At an accelerated rate. She's compensating for the scans, altering her neural patterns in real time. We cannot explain it." Sarah's mind raced. What the hell was going on? Why was she reacting like this? The last thing she remembered was feeling an overwhelming sense of fatigue during the scans. But now her body was buzzing, every fiber of her being seemingly alive with energy. She could feel the rapid firing of synapses, the burning heat in her muscles as if they were strengthening before her eyes. "She must be experiencing some form of hyperactivity," the technician continued, seemingly unaware of Sarah's mounting panic. "The human body is not designed for this level of input. It should have caused a breakdown by now." The commander, Varrock, she now knew him to be called, stepped forward, his sharp obsidian eyes narrowing at the technician's readings. "What are you saying?" The technician was quiet. "She's evolving," the technician repeated, more urgently now. "Her physiology it's not supposed to do this. Her brainwave activity has shifted in a way that makes her almost impervious to the scans. She's not just surviving, she's adapting at an exponential rate. Varick's gaze turned back to Sarah. There was something dangerous in the way he looked at her now, something more than just curiosity. This wasn't what he had planned. It wasn't supposed to be like this. She was supposed to be a simple subject, one that could be studied, dissected, and discarded when the time came. Instead, she was becoming something they couldn't understand. "Shut it down," Varick commanded. "We cannot afford to lose control of the situation." The technician fumbled with the controls, trying to halt the scan, but it was too late. The ship's systems began to glitch, the lights flickered, and the once sterile air seemed to thicken, charged with an unexplainable energy. "What's happening?" Varick demanded, his voice suddenly harsh. We don't know," the technician stammered, eyes wide in disbelief. "Her biological system is destabilizing the systems. Her neural patterns are influencing the ship's interface." Sarah's eyes widened in realization. Her body was doing this. She was causing it. A wave of dizziness swept over her as she struggled to stay conscious, her heart racing, but beneath that overwhelming surge of fear, a sense of power began to take root. For the first time since the abduction, she didn't feel helpless. She didn't feel like a prisoner. Her body had found a way to fight back. Varick's voice rose again, his tone suddenly frantic. "Contain her, now!" But it was too late. Sarah's body had already begun to adjust to the environment around her. Her muscles strengthened, her mind sharpened, and the ship's systems were now responding to her, her thoughts, her commands, her fear. As the ship groaned under the pressure of her transformation, Sarah could only watch, wide-eyed, as she realized just how deep her mistake had been. She wasn't just a hostage. She was something far more dangerous. She wasn't sure yet how she would use this newfound power, but one thing was certain: she was no longer the prey. After 2 hours, she returned to the city. So you only had the courage to come only that day. She had become the predator. The metallic walls of the ship seemed to pulse with a strange energy as Sarah struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what was happening. The ship groaned, vibrating beneath her, as if it too was beginning to shift with her power. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps, but she could feel the strength building within her. She wasn't just fighting to survive anymore. She was evolving, adapting, and the ship itself seemed to be responding to her, as though her very presence was altering the ship's internal systems. Her muscles ached from the sudden surge of energy, but she couldn't stop now. She had no idea what was happening to her, but one thing was certain: this transformation, this strange ability to resist, was something she couldn't control, and that frightened her more than anything. But she wasn't going to let fear take hold. Not now. "Contain her!" The voice of the commander, Varick, echoed through the sterile chamber, but his words were distant, muffled by the pounding pulse of power that reverberated through her body. She could hear the panic in his voice, a sharp contrast to the calculated calm she had seen earlier. They had underestimated her. They had thought they could take her, break her, and use her for their experiments. If they contact Magistera, now they were the ones at her mercy. But Sarah wasn't ready to kill them, not yet. Not until she understood what was happening to her, what they had done to her. "We've got to find Patrick," Sarah said. Her eyes flicked to the technician, who was now frantically trying to regain control of the ship's systems. His fingers flew over the console, but the lights flickered in response, and the ship's hum deepened, like a living, breathing entity in distress. It wasn't just Sarah's body that was reacting. It was the very heart of the ship itself. The technician, a smaller creature with translucent skin, looked up at Sarah with wide, fearful eyes. "This shouldn't be possible," Your biology, your neural patterns, they're interfacing with the ship's systems. You're changing the data. You're rewriting everything." Sarah could feel it. The systems, the technology, the energy. The way the ship's commands no longer felt like cold, unfeeling technology. They felt alive, like they were listening to her, bending to her will. It was intoxicating, and for a fleeting moment, Sarah wondered if this was what it felt like to have real power. But that was a dangerous thought. She couldn't let herself get lost in it. Her eyes locked on Varric, whose dark, intense gaze was fixed on her, searching for a solution, a way to regain control. But she knew he was just as afraid as the technician. They didn't understand what was happening, and that made them vulnerable. "Let me go," she said, her voice quieter now but still strong. It had taken every ounce of self-control not to scream, not to lash out at the alien beings who had brought her to this place. But she had to stay focused. She had to understand the extent of her newfound abilities before she did anything rash. "Let me go, and I won't do anything." Varric didn't move for a long moment. He studied her, his sharp eyes scanning her every movement, every gesture. She could see the calculation in his gaze, the cold, detached evaluation of a commander trying to assess the threat. He knew, deep down, that he had underestimated her, but there was something else, a glimmer of realization that she wasn't the same as the other humans they had captured. He stepped closer, his tall form casting a long shadow over her, and she braced herself. But instead of attacking, as she had expected, he spoke, his voice low and controlled. "You think you're in control," Varric said, "but you're not yet. We will adapt to your resistance. We've studied your kind for long enough. Your biology may be able to fight our systems, but it won't hold. We are the more advanced species." For a moment, Sarah hesitated. Was he right? Was this just a temporary surge? Was this power merely an illusion? But as she focused, as she concentrated on the shifting, changing currents of energy inside her, she realized something. No, this wasn't an illusion. This was real. This was her. She reached out and touched his arm. Her hand was warm and soft, lowering him to the ground. "I'm not going to stop," she said firmly, pushing against the restraints that still held her. "And if you think you can outsmart me, you're wrong. You're out of your depth." Varric's expression remained unreadable, but the tension in the room grew palpable. The crew, those that remained on the ship, moved about with growing urgency. They had been trained to handle everything from diplomatic negotiations to high-intensity combat. But this was something they hadn't been prepared for. Sarah could sense their growing unease. She could feel their minds working, trying to calculate how to deal with her. They had underestimated the potential of human adaptability, and now it was too late. Whatever they had done to her, whatever technology they had introduced into her body, was no longer something they could control. As she concentrated harder, she began to understand the technology of the ship itself. It wasn't just alien, it was intuitive. The ship's system seemed to respond to her thoughts, her emotions, like an extension of her own consciousness. She could feel the data streams pulsing, the energy fields shifting in response to her will. It was like learning to control an instrument she had never played before, and she was learning quickly. Her heart raced as she realized the extent of her connection to the ship. She could feel the hum of the engines, the flicker of the navigation systems, the heartbeat of the life support systems. Everything was connected, and everything was hers to control. With a sudden, almost instinctual movement, she focused her thoughts on the restraints that held her to the table. They began to vibrate, and then, with a soft click, they released. The metal cuffs that had held her wrists and ankles loosened and fell away, clattering against the floor. She moved her arms slowly, testing the newfound freedom. Her body felt light, her senses sharp. She had never felt so alive, so in control. But with that power came a weight, a responsibility she wasn't sure she was ready to bear. "Stop." Varroc's voice was sharp, filled with urgency. "You don't know what you're doing." Sarah turned her gaze to him. The commander had backed away, his expression one of disbelief and frustration. His posture was rigid, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You're tampering with forces you cannot understand," he said, his voice strained. "If you destroy the ship, if you interfere with our systems, you will die along with us." Sarah looked around at the room, at the alien technology that hummed and pulsed like it was alive. She could feel the ship's heartbeat in her chest, resonating with her own. The energy inside her surged, and with it, a sense of clarity washed over her. She was not going to destroy them, but she was going to make sure they understood that she was no longer a prisoner. "I don't want to destroy this ship," she said slowly, her voice steady, despite the uncertainty that loomed in her mind. "But I'm not going to let you use me. I'm not your experiment, and I'm not your weapon. If you want to get out of this alive, you're going to have to help me get back to Earth. Understand?" Varroc's dark eyes flicked to the technician, and there was a brief exchange between them, silent, unspoken. Sarah could see the hesitation in their movements. They had been trained to deal with many things, but nothing like this. Nothing like her. Finally, Varroc nodded, though his eyes never left her. "You've proven your point, human. We will not interfere with your escape. But know this. You are not the only one who has adapted. The Bexari are already aware of us. They will come for you, for all of us. And when they do, we will see who is truly in control." Sarah didn't respond right away. She could feel the weight of his words, the threat behind them. The Bexari. Whoever they were coming. She wasn't just a prisoner anymore. She was the key to something much bigger. And now, for the first time since her abduction, she wasn't running from the danger. She was running toward it. She looked back down the hall to see that the two men had left